Yeah, it's so I just reached out kind of weirdly. Barbara from the Noetic Society gave me the course info and was like, "Oh, cool, Pierre's doing this thing." And I was like, "Oh, I've subscribed to this person's channel and watched some of your videos, and it's cool. It's weird. I don't know. Like we're in this time where people run courses online, and it's like, oh
Yeah.
wow, I can support Pierre and see what this is about. And what I loved about what you're doing is it was like reasonably priced. It wasn't some like $1,000 or $400 like
Yeah.
celebrity event or something like that. I felt like it was very financially accessible to people. So,
Yeah.
anyways, that's why I reached out, and it's very nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, that's great. I mean that um, yeah, Pierre's work is gonna draw I think a really, for me, interesting demographic. People who are interested in psychology and philosophy, but also I have a twinge of the maybe mystical bent. So I enjoy that. I'm not like, so we had very cursory discussions about the course, and basically myself and Adina Bezarita, who is she's an Oxford Cambridge scholar and philosopher. She's very good friends with Pierre, and her and I, along with Dr. Mervat Nasser, are we are the three organizers for the New Hermopolis conference in Egypt this year, in August. So Adina introduced me to Pierre, and we had some preliminary talks. But my philosophy on this was to basically, I'm going to be hands off. So, because it's Pierre. So we had some brief discussions on what the course would sort of generally entail. Uh, I love that kind of stuff because I love that marriage, but I'm going to be taking the course for the first time as well when Pierre gives it. So I'm not dialed into the actual itinerary of the class, but it took the form more of these general philosophical conversations, and I love um esoteric Taoism is, I got into that stuff before I was even interested in the Western, before I knew the Western esoteric traditions existed. Because they're not, it's only very recently that these things are coming to any sort of mainstream prominence. And there's this very delineated, coherent historical, um, trajectory that's being presented. I mean, people like Tobias Churton, Nicholas Goodrick Clark, they Walter Hanegraaff, they've been working on this stuff, chipping away, forming the outline of it for years, for maybe decades, really, particularly with Tobias Churton. Um, but it's only now that it's being seized upon by practitioners. And the interesting intersection of all that stuff is happens with people like you have had on your channel, John Vervicke, Eric Arwal, um, they're doing philosophical work in popularizing and making relevant things like Neoplatonism and Platonism for people. And that's really what I try to do too, because, Four Great Dialogues by Plato were was one of the first actual books that I ever read. I was very
Cool.
young, and or Five Great Dialogues, and it fundamentally changed my perspective on everything in ways that I couldn't have understood because I was still developing. So it's not like,
How
oh,
old are you?
I was, I think, 14.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, my dad used to, he was a contractor, and he used to work in, he used to make bookstores in, we lived in New
Wow,
York, but he used to build bookstores, Random House in,
that's
in,
amazing. That's really
yeah, in the 90s.
huh,
And so, he would come home with these piles of books,
that's great.
Yeah, and we're
Yeah.
Greek. My dad's Greek, my mom's Italian, but my dad would bring me all the great Greek philosophers and tell me it's kind of like, my big fat Greek wedding. Greeks have made everything. They're the foundation of everything. Like, you got to learn this stuff. And I guess he was maybe trying to turn me into a doctor or a lawyer and make me smart, but really it just made me check out of society and I became a musician and took psychedelics and stuff. Because really when
That's
you
great. What instruments do you play, or what kind of music do you do?
well, it- it's rare that I play anymore like live. I like for my channel
Yeah,
and
just
and
personally, I don't think someone has to be a professional to be like a lover
yeah,
of music and to
yeah. I'm
enjoy and appreciate. Really, taking something and turning it into something you can make the world more beautiful with is mind blowing to me. So I don't think you even have to perform publicly to really
yeah.
do that. So yeah, I was wondering just more.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, I started out on drums, but I also play
oh,
guitar.
cool.
I play a little bit of piano. I play bass. I like to sing. Um, I don't know. I could figure out most instruments at this point.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I was a professional musician for years.
Oh,
I did
wow.
touring and studio gigs and stuff. Session drumming. Really, my main my
Amazing.
studio my professional stuff was in drums and percussion, and then I
Huh.
had a solo project for a little while where I was the lead guitar player and I sang and I had like a nine-piece band.
Wow. No, I love that because a lot of like philosophers and philosophy-minded people don't do things, and you're like engaging with reality and trying things that you're not comfortable with. And I think art, if you just don't worry about art critics so much, if you think about creativity as expression, then art is incredibly like soulful and interesting. And so that was awesome to hear. And yeah, it's so interesting too that your father was like, "Hey, books are awesome. Like, check these out. Like, even these people from thousands of years ago could actually impact how you think." And I agree that like even if you look at the Roman Empire, they were just adoring and using and caring about Greek literature, and a lot of even the best Greek Latin thinkers wrote in Greek. So I find um,
Yeah, true.
just yeah, like pan-Hellenism and the idea of like how good Hellenism can be for other cultures to be a very real phenomenon. And so I love like what you're saying. And yeah, I agree that like I've hung out with Pierre's Noetic Society, and they like psychology, philosophy, um, spirituality, mysticism, maybe, and things like that. And it's amazing that someone like that has spent virtually their whole adult life surrounding themselves with Plato and Proclus and the I-Ching and these secondary sources and things like that, and then wants to share it with others and helps others go like, oh, I never looked at that text that way, or oh, I didn't realize because of what we were talking about that love could be different than I was conceiving of it before. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
yeah,
that's the
just
thing to me
cool.
about play, it kind of learning or reading some of the Platonic dialogues like the Phaedrus, Symposium, uh, sections of the Republic as a young kid, it I feel like there's less in the way. Like I didn't have I didn't have a scholarly introduction to Plato. I didn't learn about Plato from a philosophy 101 or a classics course or anything like that. So I didn't have anybody framing a narrative with which I am now going forward going to view this. Because a lot of academics, when I did get to college, they didn't want to talk about Plato. They want to talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialists, and stuff
I've
like
heard
that.
that before. Yeah, you
Which,
have to
which
like
is
be a awesome Kantian and then bring up Kant all the time. But you can't
exactly.
say like, what's the good life or what is beauty? I've never really pondered that before.
Right,
Yeah.
because we're post good life and we're post beauty.
Cool.
We
Not
we
me.
live in
That
we
doesn't
live in
sound
a
like you either. Yeah.
we live in a postmodern society, so it's like the inculcation is always towards um skepticism and criticism. And the thing is, like
Yeah.
at one point, those tools of exegesis were useful because of the amount of credulity. but now they've kind of overstayed their welcome and they're dominating. They're like, because they're analytical tools.
Right. I
Um,
think it's just people that use them are too one-dimensional sometimes, and that's really the problem because Platonism even espouses like kind of anti-skepticism, yet it in some way influenced like the very founders of skepticism. So
right.
when you look at the pre-Socratic Socrates and then the people that are awesome from that era, they seem to be operating at a higher intellectual level on average, and this level of sophistication that they have. And yeah, it's so cool hearing you say that, like, oh, I didn't have to filter it through professors that were boring or not really doing things that were useful outside of this kind of academic jargon and expertise. I was
Yeah.
lucky. I had these philosophy professors that would take us outside and they'd say, like, what is courage? And then they would say, look, this is the history of Christianity. And it went from this to this to this. And there's the
Uh,
Baroque and the classical. And you go, wow, I really lived uh, the history of my culture is incredibly rich, and there's
mhm.
these figures in like every age that are just doing groundbreaking things that kind of transcend old thinking and change. And yeah, and then postmodernism and modernism, like they talked about Foucault a little bit and
Mhm.
Freud, but unpacking like after 1900
Yeah.
is kind of
They
a
they talk
wild
they
west.
everybody loves to lean on Freud, but it's like, but like Jung had like the cult following, because he was more of a mystic and stuff like that. They bring him up in certain, at least, I was having these classes and I like 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. Like that's when I was in college. But it's so the environment may have changed. I don't really know, but you know, we didn't get a whole lot of attention on Jung. I got into Jung starting to take an interest in the works of Joseph Campbell around the same time. Like, why aren't
Yeah,
we
yeah,
covering?
Campbell I saw a lot in college for sure.
Why did this guy? Why did Jung in my my courses? Why did he get like maybe 8 sentences in a module? He should have had his own course, really. But the thing is, for me, I've always, because of I've had that kind of unadulterated exposure to Plato, and I also have an intimate familiar with Greek culture.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
matter how much it's changed in the modern day, like my dad's from Greece. Yeah, I'm so technically I'm like first generation, but they presented to me as mystical documents. They were a spiritual canon before they were
I
anything else.
see. I see what you mean.
So
Yeah.
that's the whole thing, is like, yeah, I'm reading these things the way some people read, you know, uh, the Avestas or the Vedas or something, like, like
Well,
I'm
and
not.
that's the way Plato is framing things too, because he references Homer, and Homeric myth is what was the foundational religion of that area, and they were much more pluralistic, and they didn't have a holy book like the Jewish culture did, or if you look at like, you know, Iranian Persian culture had a much more um, evolved concrete system where the Greeks were experimenting and they were rational and they were, full of like these poetic stories that would
Mhm.
tell of their people's adventures to Troy and things like that. And they would, the same way you can learn about morality and character from the Old or New Testament by reading the stories, the Greeks were doing that with the hero of Odysseus and with, the contrast to his son who was not courageous and things like that. And you learned about character from stories, which is what we still do in religion today. So I think the Greeks were almost lucky to be free from like a dogma that limited their thinking, and they're so creative and
Yeah, well,
I think
that's the interesting thing about the Greeks, is that, Greece wasn't a land. It wasn't a nation, the way that it wasn't even a national identity, the way that we kind of, now that the world has, in the age of globalism, been carved up, divided, now is kind of being blanketed by a uniform authority. Was much more, if you go to Greece and you look at the land and you travel the land. And this is another one of the great privileges I had in my youth. I spent the entire summer, 3 months every year in Greece, traveling with family from my youth.
I have
And
friends that do that too, yeah, and that they loved it growing up, and they're like, oh, now I want my kids to do that, and I think it'd be
Yeah.
awesome. I have a friend that is sending his daughter, their daughter, and some friends over to Greece next summer, and it's like, oh wow, you can be immersed in like this vegetation and old buildings. I'm near Tarpon Springs in Florida, and we have a Greek culture that's over 100 years old. And they throw a crown in the river and dive in. The young men dive in to get it, and there's real traditions, and there's Christian
Yeah.
churches with Greek Bibles and street names that are in
Yeah.
Greek and stuff. And it's like, I love this. And the people
Yeah.
that are from Greece are so friendly and casual and like, oh, here, have some food, hang out and enjoy the day. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is not like most of commercialized America.
Yeah, I mean some of Athens and particularly like the younger neighborhoods are getting a little bit more commercialized, but the thing is the topography of Greece anciently is what really created the Greek, I guess, sort of the prototype, right? Or the Greek unit. The Grecian unit was the polis, city state,
Yeah.
so and the
Yeah, the
reason for that is
Dems
because
and all of the different structures and stuff. Yeah.
yes, because the thing is, like, Greece is a land consistently divided. And now you've got, you know, um, the Mediterranean Greece, all the islands, and they are separated and they have their own culture. And a lot
Yeah.
of them are actually very difficult. A few of them are difficult to get to.
Well,
Look at
that's why they're so interesting. Yeah, because literally, like ships of people get blown off course, and then like 200 years later, there's like three different types of people living on the island, and then they have histories where they're cooperating, splitting, and not interacting. The Minoans, like even in the last 50 years, they've uncovered like all this information about Minoans and how
yeah.
sophisticated the architecture was, and they were so good at trade and travel. And it's like, yeah, when you have all of that isolated culture not being influenced by all these meta cultures and all of these like giant
Well, they
mono
resisted
cultures.
that. They
Right.
resisted
No,
the
I love it.
constant. Yeah.
I wish there was a mountain I could live on right now and just like goat herd
Well,
and, use the internet or something.
yeah, and if you've been, you go to Athens and stuff like that, you start to realize like, okay, this the Peloponnese is bordered by water on one side and mountains on the other. So Greece is extremely mountainous and it's arid. It has a very dry climate. It has a desert-like climate. I wouldn't say it like you go to a place like the Midwest in the United States, around the Verde Valley and Phoenix, Arizona, and stuff like that. It's not that dry, but
No, not
it's
at all. Yeah,
similar.
it's more like dry temperate or something like that than actual arid desert. But it's rocky and there's a lot like if you're not a
Yes.
good climber or you're not good at going into multiple terrains to get somewhere, multiple environments, then it's not simple and one thing. Or yeah, it's interesting. That's really cool that
So,
you even bring that
so,
up.
so the thing is that the Greek identity was predicated on two things, really, which was the language. It was a language, if anything, and then the culture, which was the really the polis, the city state, and then that gets kind of, you know, it creates these microcultures, right? Because then, like the Spartans and the Athenians are like the classic example of Greeks, but they also were diametrically opposed in every way that you could possibly think of.
Right,
So
right. I mean, there are like 9 to 13 sub-languages in the US that you can kind of isolate and talk about, but the US is much more integrated, or Europe is even more integrated than that world was. And yeah, they had like Socrates went on successful and failed war campaigns, and it was so chaotic and changing. And if you read some of the people Plato brings up, it's like, oh, who are the Thracians? Who are these other groups? And you find out like, oh, they're like the Spartans. They speak Greek, but they have more of a pluralistic culture, and they're definitely different than the value systems and kind of ideas and things like that of these other
yeah.
cultures. And it's
Macedonians too.
so right. Oh, exactly right. Like Aristotle and his influence on Alexander the Great, and really like who knows if you or I would even know much about Greece if not for the Macedonians in some way, because they
Right.
spread Hellenism so far and wide that yeah, it's amazing. And Yeah, I like when people say like my town even has a cultural identity. I push back a little. I'm like, ah, it's probably very boring. But there is some truth to like Chicago is different than Miami, which is different than Washington, D.C., which is different than Dallas and stuff like that. And you now with the ability to travel and especially the internet, you can really participate in different cities even in ways you couldn't 50 years ago. So like, have you ever been to the Parthenon in Nashville?
In Nashville? No.
Yeah, there's a Parthenon replica there. And it's like, imagine if you lived next to that and every day you could go for a walk and like sit in Athena's statues, gaze or whatever, and then
Yeah.
go to the, Smoky Mountains or eat barbecue or do whatever else Nashville's doing. And it's different than maybe what's happening in Chicago or LA or anywhere else. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and that I think really created the Greek mind, in a lot of ways. And they're, of course, they were mostly a seafaring people because it was easier to sail than to go through those mountains, and it
I
kind of
would see there if there was no cars too. Like the amazing, it's really smart to use wind and winches to do manual labor when they built the Parthenon so quickly.
yeah.
They're really using their minds to go like, oh, can I get somewhere faster or easier? And you even see Greek artifacts in like Northern Europe and in other places because of how seafaring they were.
And that's but the thing was that was where the advanced civilizations were, like Egypt, which at the time of, Hellenic Greece, rather than, I would say, Hellenistic period, like I would say before the maybe even at the pre-Socratic age, but definitely before the Alexandrian conquests. Egypt was ancient then. So
I
it's like,
know. I
so
know. Yeah, Black Athena. Have you ever read that book?
I haven't.
Yeah, there's like black African philosophy books that you can find. And yeah, there was people influencing the Greek minds and temples to Athena in northern Africa. And the idea that there was not like a huge, interesting world happening down there or over there, however you want to say it,
Yeah,
is
I mean, it
yeah.
was extremely sophisticated to the point where Greeks being somewhat of a proud people, you know, um, even then it is attested by all the great minds that, like for instance, in Iamblichus and Porphyry and their various biographies of Pythagoras, and 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 things of that nature, they attest that, yeah, Pythagoras was initiated, spent 22 years in Egypt. He was
Oh, right.
initiated.
Plotinus would say, like, read the hieroglyphs, people. You can literally see him saying that in the Enneads and in quotes and stuff. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
100%.
exactly. And
Well,
and
that's what's
Plato talks
interesting
about
because
it too.
Greek rationality and Egyptian magic practice grew up next to each other. And they're so different than like British empiricism or even American pragmatism and things like modern philosophy that are really broadly popular with people. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I would even say that Greek rationalism was an outcrop. It was a development of that culture's interaction with the Egyptian priest
right,
class,
right.
specifically because you even have, several of the seven sages, the pre-Socratic men who made ancient Greece, who like literally pulled the people up by their bootstraps, Solon, Thales. They went to Egypt and learned from the priest class. And the interesting thing is this. This has been something that a through line in my researches and discovery of what was going on back then. A really clear picture starts to appear when you go granular, but then pull out and look at everything, right? That's You should constantly be toggling your perspective and not remain stuck in a granular, purely hyper analytical sort of frame of mind. You've got to pull out and you got to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. And the thing we're seeing is that it was really the ancient Egyptian priest class, right? So they end up, each priest or group of priests, it stratifies into a micro society because of their various duties, and their duties are specifically to the deities that they are devoted to, and they have to learn about the deities. But their deities were attributed, or at least the mundane bodies were represented by certain actual physical things. So, like Newt's body was the night sky. Now, that's a symbolic way of saying, like, okay, there's this principle in the universe that causes this to be able to happen, and its manifestation, similarly to the way that they would have sort of regarded the ontological, chain or of being, really down from the henad of the self down into the physical manifestation of the person and its personalities and its body, its physicality. Well, they saw those manifestations, and this goes back to ancient Babylonia, where they were saying, okay, the planet Mars, that's Marduk's actual physical body. And they're kind of correlating the gods to natural phenomenon, and so they have to study that natural phenomenon, and from that they become priest botanists, priest scribes, priest metallurgists. We this micro society completely stratified, and then what happens is the Greeks start going over and learning in their temples, and their temples are not just intellectual and rational, they're initiatic, and they become initiated. And what happens is they kind of develop at this magnitude of like to the 10th power. They go back and they start seeding.
Well, right. And
Pythagoras.
again, like if you have this really rational, intellectual, curious, smart culture, and they've got like a less rigid um, a religious ideology because of the poeticness of Homer compared to the more preachiness, let's say, of a lot of the monotheistic opportunities and cultures there. I think then, and they're open. They're like they talk to each other, and they exactly like these cultures are influencing each other, and it's so interesting to learn about because we think of, like you said, the Egyptians as being one thing or a few things, but they've got thousands of years history prior to a lot of the like cultures that we study and that we know a lot about, and then starting to go like, oh, like there was this person here saying this and these people here doing this, and then they were doing these other things and mastering different um, religious ritual concepts and experimenting with a lot of different things that maybe other cultures are less sophisticated on because they don't have as much written language and as much like manpower and organization and things like that. So they have these huge societies.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I think just like during when a war happens and people go to other places and bring back the culture, it's the same thing. It's like the Greeks were going out and they were talking to Egyptians, and you were saying too, it wasn't like so much of like Egypt, the national territory, but there was like city states of Alexandria and these different places, and you could go study there and go to Ephesius if you wanted to. And Plotinus tried to go to India, and
Yeah.
so you could actually go study with other cultures, which today is like, oh, I don't talk to foreigners. They're just weird people that I, maybe fantasize about or get angry about, but I don't actually go to other places and interact with cultures. We don't, I mean, you can do that, but most people stay very local and in kind of thought bubbles a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, and even then in Alexandria, in that period when Hellenism in that area turns into the Hellenistic period, so the Greeks at that point are really influencing the Egyptians,
What's
because
an example of that? Yeah.
well, the Egyptians were under Persian rule for almost 200 years. By the time they were completely subjugated under the Persians, they removed the dynastic rule of the pharaohs until Alexander came and conquered Persia, which is a big win for the Greek people, and got Egypt in the process. And they greeted Alexander as a liberator. And one of the first things that he did was he went to their city, the capital, the religious capital city of Memphis, and he sacrificed to the Apis bull, to their gods, and that was a sign of respect. And he reinstated pharaonic dynasty, but he positioned himself as, okay, I'm pharaoh now. And but the thing is, it's at that point where the Western esoteric traditions, as we understand them today, develop. So you've got modern astrology finally happens. The four main elements: the houses, the planets, the aspect, and the zodiac. It all comes together. right there in Alexandria, you've got modern alchemy, right? Zosimus of Panopolis, third and fourth century in Alexandria, Egypt, talking about Kairochmeta, things made by hand. His vision, his alchemical visions, starts talking about how the metallurgic process of dyeing metals is because of the underlying hermetic philosophy itself is generated at that time period. That's where it comes from. And then it wasn't solely Egyptian. Hermetic philosophy is a combination of Greek Neoplatonism and Egyptian mysticism. And then from there you get, yeah, like I was saying, the alchemy of Zosimus of Panopolis, which he very explicitly, he goes to great pains to say this these underlying principles exist in everything. So the same way we're applying them to metals, you can apply them to the body and you can apply them to the human spirit. So
Well, that's why principles are much more interesting than dogma and figure worship. Like I love learning about Socrates or Jesus or Lao Tzu or the Buddha or any of these people, but there's something about learning principles that is unique. And I think people get a lot of bad rap for saying, like, oh, if you think about principles, then you must not honor God or things like that. But I don't see that in those people you just mentioned at all. I see Hypatia and Proclus and Plotinus and all of these people as incredibly respectful, reverential, I would say, and trying to be good in a very weird times in history, but definitely not like
well,
idiots or irreligious or things like that. Like it's almost shocking to me sometimes when people talk about Platonism or Neoplatonism and how little they've spent understanding it.
yeah.
Obviously not like unlike you, who is I mean I can't even imagine you probably spent like 10 or 20,000 hours of your life at this point, just like engaging in Greek culture and engaging in
It's all I think
classical.
about. All I
Right, right. That's what I mean. Like, I think someone like you, I can actually listen to because you've thought a lot about it. The same way if I go to a great math professor who studied math for 10 or 20,000 hours or 10 or 20 years, then I'm going to go, oh, I bet I can learn algebra from you better than just reading a book or trying with talking to my friends or something like
Yeah.
that.
Well, I mean, I have several advantages that kind of that when I was growing up, I thought they were disadvantages. Like I don't have as much as I went to college, but I dropped out. I dropped out to go on tour and play music and all that stuff, and I never finished really. I ended up getting I ended up going back later in life, but I learned techniques of research. I learned how to do the basic things, that kind of subject your own biases to, and to that kind of academic skepticism, and then try and how to cite things. Like, okay, you can have a hypothesis, you can have something you lean towards, but you have to designate that that's speculation, or go out, find resources, put together an argument, and then here's I'm citing my sources. This makes sense, proffered out. So those are very, very helpful things. But at a certain point, I feel like I wanted to become a teacher, but then I realized like I can't play like it's a very tiny, they demarcate the playing field too much for me. Like I need to be able to also, I'm a practitioner. I practice ceremonial magic. I practice ritual. I am an astrologer. I practice practical alchemy. I do all of these. I read Divine by Tarot, all of it. So I need to be able to do that. And that gives me insight. Never mind the fact that, I can speak Greek and I have that culture instilled in me. And so I kind of understand a little bit more of the cultural nuance. Not a tremendous amount. We're talking about thousands of years
No,
here.
no, I mean that's what college is supposed to do though, is just introduce you to things, give you some skills. And I think that's part of the general education idea is like courses are really broad, but if something catches someone's interest, they can then explore it more. And so even a bachelor's in anything doesn't make you even capable of doing it as a job, maybe other than high school or middle school teacher. Because if you have a chemistry degree, you're probably more likely to be an assistant manager in a restaurant than a chemist. So, and I've studied organizational psychology. Like I know how job selection works. And I was telling you in the email, like callings, it sounds to me like you have a calling for music, and you like communication, and you like you feel actual roots to some cultures that you are originated from, and so you spend a lot of time learning about your roots and then sharing it with people that are interested.
Yeah.
And I think lifelong learning is almost like a life hack. If you're willing to be a little bit independent,
Mm.
experimental, and just learn new things and get out of your comfort zone, if you actually watch a lot of people after 20 to 25, they stay within their comfort zone most of the time. And if they're smart, they don't do things that might embarrass them intellectually. And if they're
Right.
never been seen as athletic, they might never try sports. Or if they were really athletic, they might seek out sports all the time. And so we really stop growing a lot around 20 to 25. But I think someone like you, it's like, oh, and I was saying this in the email too, it's like we're kind of in a golden age. If you just want to read really cool old text, instead of having one bad translation they have to check out from a library, you can have 8 translations, compare them, start learning languages from apps and websites. I mean, I've met countless people that are self-taught in instruments. You would have never seen that in like the 80s because the information wasn't there. But now
Right.
that we live in this information boom, if you're independent and curious and have a little bit of like tenacity, you can go very, very far in this world. And who cares if you don't have a degree? Because what are you going to do? Like burn that in a fire one day to keep you warm? It's only good for getting jobs and getting new ideas. I think it's cool to still go to colleges and take like adult level learning if you're into something, because
Yeah.
then there's no grades. You can kind of just ask questions to the professor and say like, oh, I read this thing by this guy Arcanvm on YouTube, is this true? And then the person's like, oh, that's cool, and like have a conversation with you or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I like the way you put it that people don't do things that intellectually embarrass them. I feel like that's a big stumbling block. I feel like that's really the intrepid nature of like I am so right, and this is what the philosophers used to say. I am a lover of wisdom, you know. So
I
it's
like the
like
Stoic. I think it was I'm forgetting which one, but he was carrying like a lentil pot, and he was always being too cautious and wouldn't actually practice enough stoicism. So maybe Zeno or Xenophon, one of those guys, and like they'd whack the pot and make him like drop all the soup on, embarrass himself, and go, "You're being too cautious. Practice stoicism." So even when you're like within stoicism, you can be too cautious and uptight, I think.
yeah, absolutely. But it's one of those things where it's got you have to be okay. The desire or the eros for higher, I want to say like capital T truth has to trump your fear of embarrassment. You've got to be able to, I think so much of how we've been able to be successfully corralled into a positivistic intellectual paradigm, um,
Uh-huh.
a reductionist paradigm is
Right,
because a
right.
lot of us are just afraid to embarrass ourselves intellectually. I love it when I'm wrong, and I frequently am, because what happens is I always somebody will either tactfully or not approach me on the subject, and then I that's an opportunity for me to sort out my information.
Right, right. And bouncing off, disagreeing with people is really healthy. And it's funny. I try to say this a little tactfully. I like to watch YouTube videos and social media from like radically different groups and expose myself to opinions that I find uncomfortable sometimes.
Right.
Mostly, I find like I like to read Plotinus and things I really agree with and learn from. But I'll also try to evaluate multiple sides and be around people that I maybe disagree with just to see what's happening. And I
Great.
noticed that I would try to like put comments sometimes in the videos, and people would just jump on me for saying the most plain rational things. And I literally said one time, not that long ago, I said, um, I like to not over correlate people's secondary features with their personalities and their philosophies. And then just out of like 100 comments, someone started jumping on that and saying like, "That's so elitist and you're such a nerd." And I was like, "Wait, this is a video on why people are being tribal and segregating, and I'm just trying to bring up a little bit of critical thinking." and
Uh-huh.
I'm getting jumped on for saying that, like that is to me the strangest behavior I could imagine.
Yeah, well, something has definitely radically shifted. At the like at the beginning of the internet, you had a bunch of people trying to talk me off a ledge, where it was like, the modern usage is like, well, somebody told me the rule book hasn't been written, but we'll figure it out. And then on the other hand, they would say, well, it's just the minorities are there, the whatever intellectual minority of people that are negative and want to pounce on you, that psychological need to sort of um, dominate or insert themselves, that now they just have a platform to be vocal. But to be honest with you, I've watched people that I know kind of change. A
Yeah,
lot of
people
people,
should change. And you should encourage people to say like, "Oh, I changed my mind on that." And
but
actually I've
not in a great way. I don't mean to be cynical, but
oh,
I've
I
seen
thought you meant like people can
no,
grow and get better and stuff. Yeah.
no, I mean, I've seen
I
people do
see.
that, but it usually has very little to do with the internet. Yeah, usually
Right,
has
right.
very little to do with being on social media, crapping on people. And I've seen that it kind of allow that level of anonymity and distance is changing the way that we interact with each other, and there are whole environments that are becoming completely hostile to the point where like people who do have something to say choose not to when that could have
Right,
been.
right. How dangerous is that when some of the smartest people in a community are not sharing their thoughts with others because of fear of retaliation? Yeah, I don't want to
Right.
get too much into like the political tragedy that is the modern era, but
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying. And I like I was listening to Jonathan Haidt the other day, and I like
Yeah.
people that are just willing to be more in the center and look at diverse opinions rather than be at this extreme and just go like, if you're not near or in this extreme, you're clearly wrong. And it's just like, isn't there enough tragedy in the world without us
And
doing intellectual murder?
that's another key feature for me of somebody that makes a great philosopher and a great teacher. So there's that fearlessness of being wrong, and then also this willingness to hear all the other sides, and now and an embrace in doing that. But then really another key feature for me that I find really important is, as you mentioned, to your point, being a lifelong learner. But the thing is, I feel like a lot of people, they know how to absorb information that is presented to them, but they
Mhm.
don't know how they learn. And I didn't learn how I learned until I was in my late 20s. And
Yeah,
I
how do
know
you learn? What are 3 or 4 tips that you can maybe share with someone if they heard this that
for
would let
me,
them go, oh, I'm not even aware of how I learn? Yeah.
right. So for me, I I enjoy, well, immersion is one of those things. I kind of personally, I subscribe to, I don't even know if this is like a true quote, but it makes sense to me. It was either Mozart or attributed to Mozart or Beethoven. They said like, and I'll paraphrase it, like, if I waited for inspiration, I would never write or finish anything. And I kind of feel that way where it's like, I have to constantly sit. I consider it like sitting at my instrument. I have to sit with a book. I have to sit with my notes. I have to sit with my thoughts every day, and go through these things and like examine things from multiple angles. This is sort of intellectual contemplation that leads to immersion. And one of the things that I know is that if I see something written down, um, I will typically remember it if it's like a line or something. I kind of can visualize what I read in my head, but I really, really integrate it when I write it down. So I make notes. And if I'm listening to somebody and I don't have the visual aid, I'm taking notes because now I'm looking at what I'm writing and I can recall it visually. And then really is to, you know, the, I com I combine I have a lot of mental energy, and
Yeah, I can
one of the
tell.
ways I'm able to ground the mental energy is in physicality, right? So if we wanted to
Yeah,
look at that
yeah. Well, like you
elementally,
brought up John Vervaeke and like enacting ideas rather
yes.
than just contemplating them intellectually or whatever. And even like creativity. I was talking to an artist like a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me about how a lot of artists work through thoughts and experiences and feelings in the creative process. And I was like, oh wow, I can kind of do that as a philosopher. And if
Mhm.
I'm grappling with something, I could make 6 or 8 art projects, and each of them might be different, but by doing that, I'm like working with the information and the concepts and what's happening very, very differently, and having like little insights or realizing something I thought was true was false, and different things like that. But I'm very much a big fan of immersive learning, and if especially if you're learning language, doing it every day, doing it constantly, little bits across space and time are great ways to learn deeply. And so yeah, I think that's really cool. And then it's like if you're picking things that are personally meaningful and making decisions that are guiding what you're doing with all that creativity, then it's like, oh, this is so meaningful for someone to just enrich themselves through culture and ideas and stuff, rather
One of
than
the
just be a what my friend says, like a cow eating grass with part of the herd or whatever. Like
right.
he's very
Well,
Heideggerian in some sense.
one of the biggest things for me is that I like to involve so I view all of reality as a composite of deterministic component and free will, which means that there's a random component. And so the random component is how I invite God in.
Okay.
Because otherwise, when I have kind of like pushed through with my own will and
Okay.
my own sort of, and sometimes you need to do that, and that's called discipline. But
Right. Right.
sometimes when you're beating your head against the wall, God, the universe, source, serendipity,
Yeah,
whatever
I
you
like
want to call
allopoetic. I feel like there's a part of reality that's very outside of me, and that's participating
it.
with
Right.
me from outside of me.
And if you insist, I have found that if you insist on pushing a door that's not opening, it will step in, and you will force its hand. And so that's not as good to me. Well, because it can be, it's not that it's not good, but it can be extremely disruptive. And sometimes you need that, but I rather like to be guided. I like to invite that component in to the process and guide me. And it would played a huge part in when I was making music. But what's really important is that people go and they look online now for books and what should I read, and who should I
Yeah,
be reading and all stuff. And I think that's good. It has its own purposes, but
sure.
or benefits. But what happened to like just walking into a bookstore and just having a synchronicity where you were just talking
I
about
know.
something?
I live near Barnes and Nobles, and a bunch of books I own that I love that are so good are just from walking in. It's I study art a lot lately, and there's an idea that you can create top down by thinking about the beginning and the end and just
Mhm.
working there, or by just starting at the first step and making decisions as you explore and following that. And it's very different because you end up going like, I like this, I don't like that. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's not as interesting as I just thought. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, I'm going to buy this book. Or I love Barnes and Nobles. They have little chairs. You can sit down and read something, and go like, I didn't even want to buy this. I was like in a shopping mood or something, and I realized I don't need to buy anything right now. And
Yep.
it's very, very different than trying to like you were kind of saying. There's this reductive idea that we can top down control everything, and if you think you can just be like a Napoleonic command structure that is just like, oh, this is high level, low level, aim the cannonballs, it's like, good luck. There's so much. I like Alan Watts and people like that, like moreness to
Mhm.
reality than you
Mhm.
could ever systematize and control. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it will. I hate this term. I really hate it, but
it's
I'll use it because I think a lot of people will understand it if I put it this way. But it re-enchants your world.
well, yeah,
And
yeah. I take courses with Tom Cheetham, who's a Henry Corbin scholar, and stuff like that. And yeah, there's a lot of people not doing cynical postmodern reductive stuff. And if you just immerse yourselves in them, or again, like take a course about Pierre Grimes or with Pierre
yeah,
Grimes, or learn of not someone having opinions about Plotinus and Egypt, but someone that like claims to immerse themselves in it, and when you talk to them, you're like, yeah, it seems pretty true that they are immersing themselves in that, and going
well,
like, oh, how cool is this that we can be in dialogue like that?
what's really interesting to me is the intersection of Neoplatonic philosophy, Hermetic philosophy. Even I love what I guess what I would call classical Gnosticism, Valentinian, Basilidian. And even, the Sethian canons are really, really fun to read. But going back to more the Neoplatonic uh, works, the intersection of real immersion into that philosophy and praxis. So it's you're not just sort of it's not this armchair study of Neoplatonism, but and it's not right. The application of Neoplatonism to mundane life uh, could be construed as in our postmodern age where we shun the woo woo stuff. It just turns into Stoicism, which I think is what's really why Stoicism has become really huge nowadays. But to really kind of practice theoria, and this kind of noetic contemplation that has to bleed out into a lifestyle. It's not, yeah, I sat in deep contemplation and then I went and indulged myself. It has to, at least for a little
Well, yeah,
while,
yeah.
it has to
There's
bleed out.
lotus eating fools as well that contemplate and meditate. But yeah, no, it's that's what I think is so interesting, and like what was coming up in my mind is like orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, and
Mhm.
I really like Eastern Orthodox traditions, and even there's countries that were reading Proclus in Greek 300 years ago. Like there's definitely parts of the world and parts of culture that are way more into a kind of yeah, I don't even know what words to say, just into this kind of idea that you can practice knowing the good
Yeah.
through contemplation and through ideas that Gregory Shaw, again, I think I've watched that interview on your channel like 4 times, and he's so interesting to hear and to learn it from, and the even the life stories that he said of how he like went from being an extremely almost monastic person to more balanced and things like that. It's like, oh, that's cool that it's not like he's even some extreme weirdo. He's actually like a human being and
Yeah.
has grown from these practices as well as like tried to reverse engineer them and bring them into his life and scholarly and almost like non-scholarly ways.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I mean, it's also, the praxis is also a key to uh the understanding, the unlocking of the philosophy, because there's so much that we scratch our heads over, particularly with the language, in which a lot of these texts utilize that either Koine or Attic or this ancient the Greek of antiquity. Really, it doesn't have the same syntax, it doesn't have the same.
oh yeah,
It's
I have a
very
Greek
different, very
tutor,
poetic.
and yeah, I like a lot of the Noetic Society people bring up Greek when we're meeting and stuff, and yeah, it's really important to like learn about what life might have been like for the people as well as like read the text and understand the concepts and things like that. And I like the idea that rationality discursively has limits, but that you can enact practices that access knowledge in ways that are real and I have friends now and have talked to scholars who are studying contemplation and looking at how varied it is and how nuanced it is. And if you read something from like 1998 on meditation in the biggest science journal you can find, it's like the tip of the iceberg compared to what a lot of these little and like kind of medium sized, but it's not even fair to call them medium sized groups are doing right
Mhm.
now in science and in ways that are, like you said, they're a little bit challenging for positivists and empiricists, and especially like pure hardcore atheists that believe, well, the idea of the principle of gravity can be invisible, but nothing else invisible is possible. So when you
Yeah,
start
they have
talking
a
about
priori
theurgy in
assumption.
Egypt and stuff like that, like they become um, like they saw garlic and they're vampires or werewolves. Like, oh, what are you doing? And they run the other direction rather than
Yeah.
being curious like scientists say they're supposed to be. Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting because, yeah, kind of going back to what we're talking about with Egypt and with Hellenistic Egypt and that Greek kind of influence. It's like, yeah, of course Of course, they went over there. The Greeks went over there, and they learned about the different aspects of nature, but they learned about it through this lens of holism. Whereas now, by way of, so a lot of people are going to have my nuts for saying
You're
something
good.
like,
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah, you're good.
every time I say it, I'm tired of apologizing, but it's really what I feel. I feel that Aristotle, he did great things for the mundane, but I find him to be, as some other philosopher has, I can't remember who said it, but I find his work to be, or his interpretation of the Platonic work to be, the first philosophical error. And so essentially what you get through people like William of Ockham and their
It's great.
nominalism
It's
is
great.
this kind of bifurcation of what was the holistic uh, sense of self, which
Well, and we
it's
lost a lot of Aristotle. We don't have his dialectic works, his poetic, a lot of his poetry and stuff like that. So
right,
what
right.
actually did become Aristotle in the West was a very analytical thing. And even when like Plotinus got misunderstood as Aristotle, other cultures grew in their knowledge of these kind of things. And you see, like, again, Corbin tracks this well. Jung tracks this a little better than definitely Freud and things
Yeah.
like that. And yeah, no, I pick up what you're putting down completely. I agree in a lot of ways. And I think, again, you can have observations important, but so is participation, and having a view and being strong is important, but also like learning about other
Yeah.
people and starting to see that's why I like Canada in a lot of ways, or what it used to be when it was more pluralistic, because a pluralistic Toronto is way more interesting to me than like a monoculture Alabama or something like that. And I would, if there was a place like Vienna that I could go live for 5 years that was this like rich, flourishing, pluralistic place, I'd be there tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean and what's interesting too is, like, even in the ancient Greek uh city state, there was a lot of monoculture, and even though
Well,
they
right, right, but relatively, I
appropriated stuff.
mean, relatively.
Yeah, yeah. The ancient Athenians, of course, they were all about education and that kind of stuff. You have Sparta on the other hand, and that's more of a very, very staunch uh sort of, but we still talk about
Well,
them. They
but they
did,
did education too. They did training,
yeah.
and they cared a lot about how their children thought and acted and what they knew and learned. So this idea that education is purely books, I think the Spartans were as industrious and as tactically brilliant as any culture, and
They
they were
understood
teaching their kids a lot.
they understood psychology, and they understood behavior. They understood what you could mold a
Oh,
human being into. It's kind of like that whole Jesuit ethos, give me the boy up to 7 years
oh
of
yeah,
age, and I will give you the man. And it's that whole thing where it's like they were training these people to be a very specific way. I have a great appreciation for that, especially because I have familial roots from that area, Laconia.
oh, cool.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
so
no, that's great.
yeah, so I've got a little bit of that in me. But yeah, it's definitely being somebody who practices, and actually when you read people that practice, like Dr. Gregory Shaw, who I had on my podcast, he the insight is really like in something in his book Theurgy and the Soul, which is making a huge comeback right now among, because theurgy is really popular. People like
Well, and
Jeffrey
he's a
Tupperman.
genius. Like he's not just rambling on and reading old text. He's making systematic, testable, thinkable things, and that's
Yeah.
why. Because I have studied a lot of people, and I'm pretty rigorous, and I've studied training with some of the most just amazing scientists on earth. I've worked with training huge organizations, and like you have to have good ideas to be able to train someone. And so Shaw's book is a thing you can learn from. You just can't, like you were saying earlier, you can go to a bookstore and grab a random book, but there's a lot of trash in the like magic alchemy section.
Yeah,
And there's a
yeah,
lot of trash. Like if I went to the religious section or the philosophy section, there's a lot of books that could make me actually like a more rigid,
yeah.
simple-minded thinker. And so I like Shaw in particular because of how smart he is and how like relevant he can be to anyone that wants to learn. And like it's important to again take advantage of this while we have it. I was reading the other day about how internet censorship is on the rise in some places, and it's like I'm so glad that I can email you and it's not getting stopped by some third party, or we can talk about these things and there's not like an algorithm whitewashing it and preening it away. So yeah, just any other people you love to read right now, and then maybe we can promote the course. And I don't want to talk for like 2 hours and take your whole day up or anything.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. Well, in certain veins, I guess I would, if we're talking about philosophy and Greek philosophy and things like that, I really like Algis Divinis. I really enjoy his work. You know, Philosophy as a Rite of Rebirth is another good one by him. Peter Kingsley, he's great. I always enjoy reading a really great a writer at at the nexus point of he really understands the practice and the you know the erudition, the history, and the context you need is actually a friend of mine, Jamie Paul Lamb. I always love his stuff. He's got a book coming out pretty soon. He's also a practitioner. Like I said, Dr. Shaw. And I like to read. I like to Angela Voss is always great, but I like to read the I like to really read a lot of the firsthand materials. You know, I like John Dillon's translation of On the Mysteries, and I am devouring constantly. I'm going through Ficino's 3 books on life, so I'm really in that particular milieu with the nexus of theurgy, philosophy, and this kind of really theurgic ascent, this work that is theurgic. So
Yeah, and you
I
mentioned Eastern stuff too at the very beginning. That almost started what you were saying. Is there anything in the East too that I love the Middle East and I love the West, but is there anything that might reach off in that direction?
Yeah, so what I have found personally is that that is a different. I would say that you got to be really careful with. I would say you have to read a lot of different translations of the esoteric Taoist
Who do
canons.
you like? Yeah, definitely. Like who have you found to be
Well,
valuable to
actually,
read or interesting?
I
Yeah.
I think somebody who is does an amazing job of distilling all of this stuff. Because when I talk to her, she's basically like, "Look, I can't give you any introductory text because it's really hard. It's really hard stuff, especially for Westerners. But I think Benabel Wen is really she's at a great meeting point. She's filtering all of this stuff. She just released a book on the I-Ching, divination with the I-Ching, but also like explaining the cosmological model, which is the foundation of Taoist philosophy in that book and with her YouTube channel. She also has another great book called The Tao of Craft. It's about the Fulu sigil crafting tradition of the esoteric Taoist canons that go all the way back to, first and second century BCE. So Benabel Wen's channel and her books are really to me second to none for somebody in my position who wants to learn more about the stuff through a Western lens, right? Because you got to get it in a way where you can learn it.
Definitely, yeah, and Pierre bridges those gaps too, and he's great. And then
Absolutely.
what about
Looking
do you
forward to his
have any?
class.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to his to this class. The conversations that we had, he kind of turned me on to Ji Ming Shin, and that's a philosopher and a teacher that um he he learned a lot from uh textually, I believe, but that's what he's going to be incorporating, or at least is some of the basis of what he's going to be talking about in his class, a Hellenistic or a Hellenic exploration of the I Ching that I'm offering on the Arcanum channel. In participation with him and Adina Bezerida, the Oxford Cambridge scholar and philosopher. She runs Numinous Threads is her kind of brand, and so we're all doing it together, but it's going to be through my channel, and Adina and I will be moderating while Pierre takes the wheel and gives the class.
Yeah, yeah, and just I'll maybe cut that into the beginning, and
Great.
anyone that comments on this video, and I'll put a form in the description, and submits just the tiniest bit of information into that, on Saturday morning, I will pick, if one person submits, that one person will get a free course and I'll pay for that. Or if four people or more submit, I'll pick two kind of randomly, or try to like hats names in a hat or something. So I'm not like, oh, I know that person and they win. And then two people I'll pay for, as well as myself. I'll be there as well. So
Beautiful.
do that, yeah, because it's such a cool opportunity. People should listen to Pierre and be around him, and like I love what you're doing. And any maybe music advice that you're listening to, because I love listening to different cultures' music and different people's musics, and obviously I don't love everything I hear, but you've talked about it. So what's a cool way to get felt alive with music, or to be inspired by beautiful music?
Um, So one of the parts, one of the most important parts of my personal praxis is curating the mental diet. And that kind of, in our society, we're just bombarded with stuff at every turn. And I do think that the intake, whatever stimulus and information is being processed by your consciousness, will ultimately affect it in a similar way that food affects the body. So my thing is that I grew up listening to heavy metal and prog rock and stuff like that, and I still love it, but I can't listen to it anymore because it
Cool.
didn't. I found that it did not affect, like, behavioral outcomes were negative. so so I switched over, actually. I embracing this kind of pull towards Middle Eastern sounds and sounds from, Andalusia, Al Andalus, and so I really enjoy like flamenco guitarists like Pepino D'Agostino, Otmar Liebert. I'm really very much into that kind of stuff. I grew up listening to the Reyes brothers, right? The Gypsy Kings. I love that stuff. But even more modern takes, it's modern composition with, I would say, a very stripped down instrument base. There's a group called Farhan Ensemble, and
They're good. Yeah, I've heard them
they're
before.
really
Yeah.
good. And it's simple, right? It's
Well,
Comanche.
that's what. Oh, yeah. Like the simplicity is what's kind of fun, because then you get three or four different simple instruments together, and you get these hour or 2 hour pieces and stuff that are amazing.
Yeah.
So cool. I'm glad you shared all those specifics. Um, I often just ask, would you do this again, or chat again? Because I maybe even after the course, you could say like what you experienced as a moderator, or 10 months from now, if I reached out, would you be interested in talking more about the Greeks and stuff
Yeah,
like that?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
I'm always learning, so I'll have hopefully more insights. So
Yeah, yeah, and just do you have like a course that you've run? I don't know a lot about the secondary stuff you're doing besides your channel, and maybe if someone
yeah.
was really interested in hearing
So
you, your experience, like how else could they plug into that?
I have a website, and
Oh,
that's
cool.
IkeBaker.com. And what you're gonna get there is you're gonna get a streaming feed from my latest. I do documentary style presentations on the Western esoteric traditions. Right now, we're at very broad, foundational subjects, because I truly believe that you have to set a really good foundation. I try to incorporate as much insight as a practitioner and of just about 20 years now and all this stuff, in one way or another. And then also I have the podcasts that stream from there, but I also have my blog, and you can read my blog, and that's a little bit more. I get a little bit more editorial in those, and so there's also a page, or at the bottom of my webpage is a list of all the other interviews that I've done. I'll just go when it's available. I'll go stick it in there. But do. I am developing a series of courses. I want to structure it basically like an academy, like the Platonic Academy to a degree. It's taking a lot of time because I just wrote two books at the same time. So I'm, I have to cool off for a little bit. But
Sure, yeah.
the book
Wow.
on the Western esoteric traditions, which will cover basically from Sumerian and Babylonian astrology up until the 21st century practices in occultism and magic, covering all the grounds: history, theory, and praxis. That's coming
Wow.
out this year by Tria Prima Press. It's called A Formless Fire: rediscovering the magical traditions of the West. And then other than that, I have offered a few courses through other venues like the Institute for Hermetic Studies. I co-taught a course there with Jamie Paul Lamb and Mark Stavish on Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy.
Wow.
So, and there'll be more of that kind of stuff in the future, but that's a quick rundown of all the stuff.
That's cool. And then what are like 3 or 4 or whatever like kind of brain dump tips for someone like Eric Orwell or me or anyone that maybe is doing just pondering starting a YouTube channel or a blog or these kind of things that like you learned from because clearly you're doing some good stuff and you've been doing it for a while and you're very passionate and not just doing it because you're bored or you want like a bunch of
Yeah.
Instagram followers. And I've never seen you like in a speedo on a cliff going like, look at my glamorous life, everybody. Oh my gosh. So I would love just any tips you have.
Yeah. So I would say lean into your excellence because it's usually associated with something that you're interested in. So lean into your excellence. Do something because you're excellent at it and you enjoy it rather than because it's popular. Don't try and catch the next wave because it's not, you don't know when that wave is going to come. I did this for 20 years and it just so happens that, this stuff is popular now. And it's like if I would have started a couple of months ago or tried to catch the bus as it was leaving, I wouldn't succeed because I wouldn't know, I wouldn't know as much. I wouldn't have the insight. And then another thing is, don't do the right thing for the wrong reasons. There are wrong reasons to pursue,
What are some of
and
those? Yeah.
they manifest.
What are some of the wrong reasons that maybe you've learned from or avoided on purpose or whatever?
You touched on it. I learned from it in music. I thankfully I lived another life before I got into this stuff that I'm doing now, and it's like you know uh, I became a musician and I subjected myself to the mores of our very sort of hyper commoditized and self-marketing society. I thought it was really cool to be in a band and stuff like that, and it wasn't really aligned with my core, and I just muscled through it for ages until I eventually collapsed and my life fell apart. And who knows, right? I might have needed it, but at the end of the day, what I learned about myself was that at 30 years old, I was still banging my head against the wall based off of a decision I had made as a 16-year-old. So allow yourself room to grow, allow yourself room to change your mind. And, like you're pointing out, the whole glamour and the egotistical, the Instagram followers, that's not a good enough reason, I don't think, to devote your life to something because you will ultimately, 9 times out of 10, I've seen constant failure because you're not in touch with the spirit of the material, whatever you're doing. In order to succeed, you have to be in touch with the spirit of the material.
Yeah, just caring about what you're doing is like instead of doing it extrinsically for fame or money or because of some insecurity that you're trying to like prove is not true or whatever. It's so amazing. I love that you said that. And Arthur versus Lewis said kind of the same thing when I asked him that question. Is like, I just love the projects I do. They are engrossing and interesting, and if people do that, they're going to be way happier.
Yeah.
So very cool. Any final thoughts or words, Ike? This has been, I think, a wide-ranging and interesting conversation that I've appreciated, as well as I just can't say enough about how I'm looking forward to your thing with Pierre. Yes, any final words or anything?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I want to say it's been a pleasure to be on and to talk with you. I like the work that you're doing a lot. You've had some of my favorite philosophers come on and talk about things in a very meaningful and applicable way. And that would be kind of what I would finish off with. It's like, non sati scire. It is not enough to know. You have to push forward, and I think that's me, but it's a very strong recommendation I make to people. Philosophy was not invented, it was not created, it was not pioneered so that we could sit here and scratch our heads and argue and debate over it in really nice tweed jackets. I mean, the thing is, like, that's what people think philosophy is. That's why people don't get philosophy majors anymore. But it's supposed to be a way of life. I think, and enacted at its finest, the telos of philosophy is living, to your point, going full circle at the beginning of this episode, living a good life.